Dr. Ben Matthews, who's a research fellow in criminology in the law school, and he's going to present his recent research on changing inequality in the profile of victims in Scotland from 2008-9 to 2017-18. So Ben, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ted. I'm just going to get my, there we go, get my screen sharing going. Yes, thank you, Ted, and also thank you, Sarah Jane. We didn't have a question, but just a comment. That was absolutely fantastic. I really, really enjoyed your presentation. So this is sort of in this paper is in the area of sort of quantitative criminology, where we come across procedural justice quite a lot, often as sort of something that plops out of a structural equation model. And it was so great to hear the complexity that can be kind of shut out from this sort of very flat quantitative analysis. Not that I'm trying to slag off anyone in particular. Anyway, this work is looking at, as Ted said, the changing profile of victims in Scotland over the last sort of decade or so. It is work in progress, so any and all feedback very much appreciated. So for some context, in the last 30 years, there's been a huge drop in crime in Scotland, the rest of the UK, in the USA, in Australia, and in parts of Europe. In Scotland alone, victimisation fell about 40% between 2008-9 and 2017-18. One of the big questions that this raises is whether crime has fallen for all groups in society equally, or put another way, has victimisation inequality changed over this period of falling crime? So here is basically what I have just said, but pictorially. So these are trends in victimisation, which is the blue line, and in police recorded crime, which is the orange line, in Scotland from the late 2000s through to the late 2010s. And we see that there is a pretty similar drop in both of around about 40%, which is a pretty big change in a pretty short period of time. But one of the difficulties with this kind of analysis is that measuring inequality is hard. Basically, we mean that some groups in society have higher average victimization rates than other groups. But any attempt to try and measure inequality relies on a bunch of what I'm going to call sort of design decisions that I won't get into the minutiae of now, but there are a whole bunch of sort of ways that people try and turn this idea of inequality into a number that you can have as an output from a statistical model, basically. So we may, for example, picking up the last of these 4 points, do we want to adjust for other confounding factors? I'm going to talk about this, and this is a theme that's going to run through the analysis later. But there are different ways that we can construct an inequality measure. This all gets harder when the outcome that you're interested in is the product of a statistical model, because you need to care about the uncertainty in your results. And this is something that I'm going to try and convince you of in my talk. So we only ever have a sample of people who respond to victimization surveys. So we are extrapolating to the population as a whole, which leads to some amount of uncertainty in our analysis. In general, any kind of best guess result, so regardless of whether you've fit a statistical model to a sample from a large population, any statistical result should be accompanied by an estimate of the precision of this best guess. And if we don't do this, we may find spurious patterns of change up or down or exactly equal, when I think often the most faithful representation of the evidence that we have is we don't know, basically, or we need more information, or perhaps we need to look at the information that we have in a different way. And I think often this can sound like a bad thing to say that I really tried to focus on the uncertainty in my results, but I think it's important, and also it can open up avenues for new research. So we know that victimisation has fallen overall in Scotland, and in this analysis we're particularly interested in how patterns of victimisation inequality, so comparing some groups in society to other groups, have changed over this time period from 2008-9 to 2017-18, and trying to factor in the limitations of our knowledge about how victimisation inequality has changed based on the available evidence. our study in particular, we took the survey responses to the Scottish Crime and Justice Survey for each sweep that has been run from 2009 to 2017-18. This is 7 sweeps of the Scottish Crime and Justice Survey. This survey is managed by Scottish Government and recruits a nationally representative sample of people in Scotland and asks them questions about their experiences of victimisation and the criminal justice system. Prior to 2008, the survey used a different design, and so data before this point are not comparable. So the reason that we have this time period is entirely data resource driven rather than anything particularly exciting that happened in 2008-9 that we think is relevant to victimisation. I mentioned before the number of sort of design decisions that go into trying to measure inequality. Another aspect of constructing an inequality measure is recognizing that inequality is multidimensional rather than purely financial, for example. And so we should try and capture this when looking at different aspects of inequality. The literature in this is pretty fragmented, but important dimensions that people have considered include age, gender, ethnicity, disability, area characteristics, so things like area deprivation measured through indices of deprivation, this sort of thing, perhaps regional inequality, financial hardship / poverty, and housing tenure. And there are some various references here to papers that have used some or most of these characteristics. I think we are the first paper to have brought all of these things together in a single analysis. Okay, so I said that we combined all these sweeps of the Crime and Justice Survey. This was about 80,000 people overall. Our outcome was the number of victimizations, which is a horrible word, but I will explain why I use that in a second, of all crime types. So this includes both sort of personal crime, crimes that happen to a particular person, but also household level crime. So if you live in a house and that house was vandalized, for example, then this would be classed as a victimization that you have experienced. Over the whole time period that we're looking at, the prevalence of victimization was around 18%. Although because of the crime drop that I just showed, this prevalence is higher at the start of the time period and lower at the end of the time period that we look at. We use the predictors that I listed before. So we have age, which is coded as a 4-level categorical variable, and I should say that almost without exception, the reason that we chose these codings for these variables were due to restrictions on the publicly available data from the Scottish Crime and Justice Survey, or sort of how the questions are asked in the Crime and Justice Survey. So that's why we have a binary measure for gender. By ethnicity, we also have a sort of an umbrella term of minority ethnic and a homogenizing term of white, which actually is something that we could do something about in terms of rather than seeing sort of white as a homogenous group, break this down into sort of white British / Scottish and white other background, which is available and something that we are considering sort of following up on as we finish up this analysis. So we have also disability, SIMD, urban rural, financial hardship, so that whether a person would find it a big problem or impossible to access £100 in an emergency, and housing tenure, just comparing people in socially rented housing to other people. So we use our statistical models to predict, in scare quotes, the average victimization rate for each socio-demographic group in each year between 2008-9 and 17-18. Social groups may be different in lots of ways. This is kind of an obvious thing to say, but people who live, for example, in areas of high deprivation may also be more likely to experience financial hardship, and both of these things might be related to victimization. So what we can do is the sort of standard approach is to use a statistical model to estimate an independent, in scare quotes again, effect of the relationship between, say, living in an area of high deprivation on victimization by statistically adjusting for differences in other characteristics of people who lived in areas of high deprivation. So we calculate these, what I've put in once more, scare quotes, adjusted rates as well as unadjusted comparisons. So an unadjusted comparison would just take all of the people that lived in areas of high deprivation, look at the average victimization rate for these people, and then compare it to the average victimization rate in people who did not live in areas of high deprivation. Whereas that adjusted measure is not in the real world anymore, but lives in stats world and asks, what would the victimization rate be for people who lived in areas of high deprivation if they were exactly like the group of people that lived in other areas across all of the other characteristics that we have measured, which is kind of a weird thing to say and a weird thing to think about, but I think this is conceptually at least what this sort of statistical adjustment is doing. And the reason that we do this is that these are considered to be a better measure of the sort of underlying drivers of victimization, these sort of independent effects, rather than the unadjusted victimization rates. I'm not going to say exactly how we do this statistical adjustment, but I have lots of bonus slides if people are particularly keen and want to know more about the gory details. And we measure victimization inequality as the ratio of these estimated victimization rates between each level of each predictor, so each of our social groups, and one reference category that we pick for each social group. Okay, so on to the results. Before we get to the results proper, just to say that I'm going to present the results in the form that you see on the left, with these sort of ribbons showing the uncertainty in our analysis. One way, the way that I sort of conceptualize these is to think of these ribbons as sort of being approximately equivalent to a bunch of plausible trajectories of these victimization rates that are consistent with our data and our statistical model. So the ribbon is kind of describing this distribution of plausible trajectories, and this is sort of almost equivalent again to the sort of animation on the right. If we think, well, any one of these trajectories could be the right one, they are all sort of consistent with the data, but we don't know which is which. So in this case, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a second when I get onto the results proper, the blue line is consistently going down and it doesn't bounce around very much, but the orange line is kind of all over the place, and we don't know if it's really going up or down or where it starts or where it stops. So there is a lot more uncertainty in the orange one than in the blue one. But the sort of the average flat trend does not mean that we have found a flat trend. It's just that we are very uncertain about what the trend actually is. Okay. So these are the unadjusted rates that I mentioned. These are just taking each group, estimating a victimization rate for that group in each year, and then putting them up on this graph. I know there is a lot of information here, so I'm going to describe it in terms of sort of 4 groups of characteristics. So by gender and by urban rural, we see falls in victimization for male female and urban and rural, without a huge amount of change over the time in our sort of inequality measure. So I am not going to say a huge amount more about these characteristics. For age, we see a pretty marked fall in victimization for the youngest age group. It's the largest fall that we see across any of the characteristics we considered. So by the end of the observation period, their victimization rate is not distinguishable from those aged 25 to 44, whereas it is clearly the highest at the start of the period that we looked at. By disability, we see a diverging trend. So both people who responded as being just having a disability to the Scottish Crime and Justice Survey have seen falls in their victimization rate, but this has fallen slower than the rate for people who said that they did not have a disability, which is why we see an increase in the inequality measure, which we have on the bottom row of these figures. Sorry, I should have said that at the start. So yes, on the bottom row, this is the ratio of the appropriately colored band in the top row to the yellow band in the top row. The yellow band is always our reference group, and so we the mostly orange figures on the bottom row are the comparison groups. By ethnicity, as we saw on the previous slide, the model is super confident that there has been a fall in victimization for white people in Scotland, but it's very uncertain about the trends in victimization for minority ethnic people, which is why when we look at this victimization inequality measure, it's pretty sure that the ratio of victimization for minority ethnic people compared to white people has increased. This is driven almost entirely by the certainty and downward trajectory of victimization for the white respondents to the Crime and Justice Survey. We have three sort of financial variables, and they all show kind of the same pattern. They of increasing victimization inequality for people who live in financial hardship, who live in the 15% most deprived areas of Scotland, and who socially rent. Yes, this inequality is increasing over time. These are the unadjusted rates. I'm going to whiz through the adjusted rates quite quickly because I think there are a lot of similarities. So again, with apologies to gender and urban rural, I'm not going to talk about that so much. For age, we effectively see the same results. For disability, the level of inequality is increased in our adjusted analysis, but the trend is flat. By ethnicity, we see that the estimate of victimization for minority ethnic people in this adjusted model, factoring in sort of all of the other characteristics that we measured, decreases, but there is still a lot of uncertainty about what this trend is. So we see the same sort of pattern in the victimization inequality estimate, but again, the level, the sort of the starting point of that victimization inequality estimate is lower in the adjusted results. For our financial variables, we see that the effect of all of these, the sort of independent effect, are highly attenuated, and only financial hardship shows any increase over time in the victimization inequality once we factor in these other characteristics. For area deprivation and by tenure, the gaps are much smaller and there isn't any real change over time in this trend. So what has this told us? Victimization has pretty clearly fallen for every group that we looked at, except for minority ethnic people, where there is a lot of uncertainty on our estimates. I think this is a pretty serious limitation of our current understanding of victimization in Scotland. Young people have seen the largest crime drop. That's the same thing we see in Scottish convictions data. I wonder if there is, maybe this is as much a cohort thing as a age thing. Something to do with, sort of a more kind of sociological generations way of looking at this, like, you know, sort of the Gen Zs and the young millennials, that kind of thing is perhaps as much as what's going on as an age thing, but that's an area for further analysis. We saw a big effect of the statistical adjustments on our estimates by disability and by ethnicity that I think might be due to the same underlying relationship that is confounding by age, that people who reported as having a disability in the Crime and Justice Survey tended to be older than other people. And as we saw, there is this very strong relationship between victimization and age. And likewise, people who reported as being minority ethnic tended to be younger than other people. Again, because of the strong relationship with age, this would expect why the statistical adjustment had a big effect on the results. I think one important thing to note that this is all of these results are conditional on our model specifications. It is almost a trope to say that there is high uncertainty in victimization estimates for minority ethnic people in Scotland, and this is usually attributed to sort of population structures, and in our random sample this means that we just don't have a lot of people to work with. I would take a maybe slightly unorthodox position and suggest that this is perhaps as much an analytical problem as a data problem, that the amount of uncertainty we have in our results are a function of what we do with the available data or choose not to do with the available data, rather than attributing this, sort of shrugging our shoulders and saying this is just the way it is. We see that the quote-unquote independent effects of area deprivation, tenure, and financial hardship are all a lot smaller than in unadjusted estimates. And perhaps this is because our statistical model is trying to untie the Gordian knot of things that are all bundled up together in real life. And so in a sense, trying to separate out these independent effects as if they are independent is describing a world that we do not live in. And as a final thought, somewhat ironically, all else being equal, that there are fewer victims of crime because of the crime drop mean that it's harder to understand victimization in Scotland through the Crime and Justice Survey, particularly for minority groups. And so there is, I think, a real avenue of what can we do in future to make better use of the data we have, either with sort of more fancy statistical modeling or augmenting with other data resources. But I'm going to stop there and say thank you very much.